Hello and welcome to the second installment of the Not a Pipe podcast. I'm going to build on last week's discussion about contested natures and the definitions for them. In the first podcast, where I initially talked about the epistemological issues of making a definition of what nature is, how nature can span from everything from the physical environment to the virtual environment, how that has an effect on the way that you do health services research into it, or any public health or other health research into it really, how you aggregate that data when you're talking about different conceptions of what nature may or may not be. So to build on that, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about the different uses of the natural environment for health purposes. So there's been a long historical pedigree of the intersection between nature and its uses for health, something that's called the medicalization of nature. This is both modern and ancient, has been used for a very long time. I'm going to run through you some of the service provisions that exist in this area to give an example, and then I'm going to focus maybe on really in a European perspective. Two cases really, looking at near where I live and another case in Finland. So one of the things I didn't necessarily talk about previously is why use natural environment for health, and it's for a number of reasons really. But if you think about the cost to the taxpayer, or even yourself if you live in a healthcare system that is privatized, of paying for medication and prescriptions and things, and the cost to society of production of antibiotics. If you can preserve your mental and physical well-being through outdoor exercise, whether that be in a fluvial, water-based environment or on land, or a mixture of the two, you don't have to pay for prescription medication. Obviously it's necessary in some circumstances, but more of the mild mental health and physical health interventions, you can use nature for many of these facets, and people have built in all kinds of cognitive behavioral therapy, therapeutic processes into natural systems as a way to get people off prescription medicine in effect, and utilize what are typically free resources. So because of this, and people have known, I'd say for quite a long time, that nature can be useful to your health and well-being as a publicly available resource. There's been quite a lot of research into it. There's a couple of key names maybe you want to look at. One is called Ulrich, whose first name escapes me, I believe it's Roger, and then there's another chap called Kaplan, who's done quite a lot of digging into this. And it does vary, you get specific subclusters and areas, which I might talk about in a second. So the work of the environmental human health work at the European Centre for Environment and Human Health, done primarily in the psychology side of it by people like Dr. Matt White and Professor Sabine Paul. Others, these are quite specific, and it's done on an epidemiological level. It's done psychologically. Some people look at it economically. It's a whole plethora of things. But if you think about it in terms of different geographies, you get different areas. So there's a concept called Nordic well-being as well. So the use of nature for physical and mental health and well-being is quite popular in Scandinavian countries, as one might expect. There's some papers by a person called Jagela. I can't never sure if I say that right. It's spelled Hjalager. And these, you can also look at something called lake wellness. You can look at specific clusters around a particular environment type. There's some papers by Jahino and Kuno, who are two Finnish academics. There's another concept called alpine wellness in the more southerly parts of Europe. You might want to look at too. Various pictures, one by a man called Pechlana and Fisher, if I remember rightly. So you get these clusters of ideas around how your physical and mental well-being can improve by the natural environment based on the environment type, and also sometimes specified by the location, i.e. is it in the Mediterranean area, is it in Northern Europe, etc., etc. You can see these are grouped really into two clusters in something that's called blue space and green space. So as you might comprehend, blue space is all the natural environments to do with water. These can be reservoirs, lakes, estuaries, tidal, non-tidal, the actual sea, bays, etc., etc. And green space naturally is all in the health interventions that are run on land, some of which I'm going to talk about too. Okay, and if you want a good review about some of the literature, there's a systematic review written by Karen Husk and others, written in 2016, which is available on the Cochrane database, I believe. So the point to say is that these environments as well are multiple types and can be both virtual as well as physical, as you might observe. And also, I suppose I should say they span all types of health interventions. So normally, if you're talking about health interventions, you can talk about the spectrum of 2Ps, so from preventative to palliative care, i.e. end-of-life care. So there's all kinds of things from the preventative, such as stress, fatigue, obesity, up to the palliative stuff that looks with use of nature for end-of-life care. So there is a big different axes that you can put it on: geography type, environment type, medical type as well. It's quite interesting, and there is naturally a long history in it. So where does the history come from? Well, in fact, you can trace it really to the origins in Europe of spa towns and almost religious sites. There's some papers by a particular man called Gessler, one in 93, one in 98, another one by Giores in 1998, that pointed out what they call the hydrotherapeutic history of European nations, i.e. a lot of the intersections between health and wellness can be traced to the emergence of the kind of spa and medical culture that the Romans brought into European countries. You see it in other countries, of course, such as Turkish baths and other things. It's not exclusively European. But they are quite often linked with hygiene and religious sites. So there was the go-to example was a shrine in Flanders in Belgium from the 13th century, which was a shrine to Saint Dimpna, which is now in Giel, and this is a site where people the religious pilgrimage tied into the caring for the mentally ill and the handicapped as well. It's almost like an almshouse model. So jumping forward a bit, these kind of practices were slightly more popularized in the UK in the 18th century, where we saw this notion of fresh air therapy. These treatments became known as open air treatment. That's it. There's a whole nice paper on this by a man called Breda from 1992. Okay, so this was a very Victorian thing. It became institutionalized into the way that asylums are run and tuberculosis hospitals are run and similar things. So you'd see it in that kind of state. There's a paper by a chap called Frumpkin from 2001 who stated basically these things became institutionalized as healing and recuperation spaces. Typically your Victorian hospitals will always have courtyards and gardens and basically nature-based sites, and many people have made these observations. It was for several things really. It was also nature was seen as a space to work for these people too, you have to understand. So you weren't, as a paper from Rush who described it as people languishing away in their lives within the walls of the hospital. You should be out invigorated doing the kind of romanticized Victorian idea of what nature is and partaking in such things. Yeah, so again, this ties into the wider cultural milieu of the Victorian era of being romantic, and you can see it in their poetry and other things as well. Without going too far into it, it's reflected in that era too. So that's how nature became to be positioned in the 18th, 19th century, the Victorian period in the UK. Obviously, this is different. You can see it changed slightly in the 19th century in Italy and other places. You saw, I think, similar movements. Okay, so more recently, you can point to these things as being priorities for governments. Even national parks have got in on the kind of act about the beneficial use of nature for promoting health. Natural England has produced reports on it, as well as there kind of being a general proliferation and re-emergence of spa culture and the uses of green and blue spaces to promote health. Yes, and I don't think historically really it was about money and cost savings to the NHS and health services or the individual patient, but I think the Victorians had more of a romantic and moralizing attempt for physical and active work. So if we were going to say what does this look like today, I'll give you a few quick examples of different provisions that you find in this service category. So first one I would like to talk to you about is introducing the idea of animals. And actually I've talked about nature and natural environment. This is not absent from everything from the kind kind of organisms that live in root nodules of plants, the bacteria, the fungal growth, up to the actual physical things like cow, sheep, farm animals, etc. Nature involves animals as well as humans and plants and fungi and all other um, all other kingdoms that you find in the taxonomy of nature. So there's something called care farming, which is it's really how can you put it? It's associated with hospitals or asylums, or it was. Sometimes it's called social farming. It's really the use of the land commercially and non-commercially, where the land is developed as a mechanism for integrating mental health activities into farm work. And there's quite a lot of work by Hassink, who wrote about this as well, who were some Dutch academics. It can be targeted to a range of conditions, primarily mental and physical. As you can imagine, farm work is both physical as well as it can be mental. Typical service users include people with learning difficulties, depression, disaffected persons, dementia patients. Drug rehabilitation is also quite common in youth services. So this can take forms of having domesticated and non-domesticated animals, and there's something called animal-assisted interventions. This is sort of a type of animal husbandry that's been adapted to mental and physical health applications. You see this in quite a lot of Scandinavian countries. I would say equally you could talk about this as being a form of well, they call it hippotherapy, the horse-based therapy. You get this in the United States of America, also in bits of England as well, I'd say, but I'd say it's not necessarily quite as prevalent. But it has a long history, the kind of pedagogy of using horses for therapeutic purposes in Scandinavia. So there's two brands. There is the use of animals for specific interventions, which is known as animal-assisted interventions. There's also a less direct form of this therapy known as animal-assisted activities, or AAA. Nothing to do with drinking, which includes concepts such as companion animals, which you may be familiar with. Okay, moving away from animals, you want to also talk about the fact that horticulture is integral to this environmental human health spectrum of service delivery. So as noted, social and psychological benefits of horticulture are well known. Plenty of people have written about this. Sempic has written about it. It's quite prevalent as an author. Just as a way that you use animals for therapeutic purposes, horticulture has these kind of two distinct forms as well. And I'll give you a definition. One is called horticultural therapy, and the other one is called, naturally, therapeutic horticulture. Horticultural therapy is the use of plants by a trained professional as a medium through which certain clinically defined goals may be met, or you can call therapeutic horticulture, which is an alternative service, which is a process by which individuals may develop well-being using plants and horticulture. This is achieved by active or passive involvement. So again, you see one sort of more targeted, one is more sort of generic in the way that you approach these things. You know, one is more goal-orientated, I suppose, in terms of its theory and its therapy. The other one is a bit more generalized in its sense. This can be done in, hospital gardens, I've mentioned already. All types of institutions had these Victorian era gardens therapies, from mental institutions, mental health institutions, hospitals, prisons, even care homes. This can be integrated into all kind of delivery perspectives. Typically, horticultural therapy deals with mental health conditions such as people who lack confidence, self-esteem, or want to get better at group interaction. Part of the rationale given for this was in a paper by a man called Lewis from '96, where they said basically plants and horticulture provide a non-threatening, non-judgmental environment for people to work in and learn to develop their social skills. Okay, so moving to something a bit more active, there's a notion of something called green exercise. I've already noted the physical benefits of light exercise in the environment are well known. You can find reports on this from the Department of Health. You can reduce stress. There's a link to reduction in anxiety as well, and combating eating disorders, post-traumatic stress as well. A paper by Diaz and Mota from 2008, and depression as well have all been linked to use of the natural environment and exercise in it. Something that's called green exercise, and when GPs prescribe this, sometimes it's called a green prescription. And it's quite simply that. It's quite a simple category where people generally will take in simple measures, looking at your blood pressure or cortisol levels, and see the effect of basic exercise that happens in nature. I'll maybe talk about the theories, some more of these nature affected theories in another broadcast. Okay, moving from a less structured environment to a more wild one. So there's something called wilderness therapy. Excuse me. Wilderness therapy, as you might imagine, is the use of traditional therapy techniques, especially for group therapy in outdoor setting, utilizing nature pursuits and other activities to enhance personal growth. And that's a quote from Davis, Bergman and Bergman from 1994. Again, target audience for this type of therapy is very similar as green exercise. It's primarily to combat emotional, psychological, and additional problems for young adults. It's quite common. We'll see quite a lot of that. The motivation being this, that the isolation, the isolation from the difficult social space that you may have been in is a way to create new, healthier routines for your mental processes. You know, typically thinking about drug addiction and other processes. Similarly, you want to take the person out of their immediate environment and introduce them into something different in the wilderness where they can break the negative patterns they've been inculcating upon themselves. Also, it's seen as a reflective environment where you can build in group work if you want to as well, which is useful. Yes, again, typical users, substance abuse, mental health issues. Yeah, so that's another sort of green and blue gym activity that you can give an example of. I think because we're running up to nearly 17 minutes, I might almost call it there, but I've talked about green space, blue space, and some of these applications have got more specific terms. There's a whole activity series devised by a organisation called the British Trust for Conservation Volunteers called the Green Gym, and similarly there's the Blue Gym as well that maps onto this. So you might see that term too as another one to come across. Yes, equally physical outdoor activity for mental health and well-being benefit in a short space of it. Using all types of environment, and again you'll see extensive literature on this by people like Matt White and other academics associated with the European Centre for Environment and Human Health, such as Ash Woolley and Wheeler and various others. You'll see there's whole books that you can purchase about this whole system. Yeah, that's it. I won't go any more into the green and blue space service provision. It gives you some kind of example. You put those terms into Google or any other academic database and you'll be able to find papers on it. It's really interesting both from a psychological but also the service delivery perspective. Nature offers all these huge different scope to develop ways to treat conditions, and it's free. So there you go, wrap it up in a bow. Next time I think we'll talk about the theoretical perspectives that people have used to explain why nature can be therapeutic and beneficial to your health and well-being. That's all from me, and well, I hope you have a lovely day. See you next time.